The following presentation was given at the Unitarian Universalist congregation of Tupelo in Tupelo, Mississippi. All are welcome to join us on Sundays at 11 a.m. at 1301 Marshall Street in Tupelo.
So as I said, mentioning the Commission on Appraisals look at our theological diversity and how it's handled within our congregations in Unitarian Universalism, it's kind of fascinating that since both of the branches, or both are branches of historical origin, the Unitarians and the Universalists, which at one point were two distinct religious movements, both of them were founded on theological differences that people were willing to die for. It's kind of disconcerting that we no longer sometimes feel that these things are even worth a conversation about over the potluck, or a conversation with a friend from a UU church over coffee. The very name that we go by, Unitarian and Universalist, were both subjects, of course, of great controversy. Michael Servetus, who first questioned the Trinity in the 16th century because he read through carefully himself, which was actually frowned upon in that era, the entire New Testament, and realized, and it is true, and even Catholic and Protestant scholars can find no place in the Testament that actually describes the Trinity as it is understood in doctrinal Christianity. It just isn't there. So all Michael Servetus did was point this out, for which he was hounded and harassed by both the Vatican and John Calvin. Ultimately, the Catholic Church burned him in effigy for just telling what he found in the actual text, and then finally John Calvin burned him in reality. So he died for pointing out what he called the errors of the Trinity and for espousing a Unitarian or unitary version of God. Other great people either died in prison or were killed directly. Faustus Socinus, Francis David, Joseph Priestley's scientific lab in London was burned for these theological positions, which we now just decline to talk about. There was less drama in the Universalist side, but no less controversy, saying that espousing a belief that all would eventually be saved, especially in contrast to the Calvinist conviction that only a rare few could hope to see the face of God, was also hugely controversial and frequently debated. So our very name is a theological discussion, one that goes on. So what have we done now instead of talking about theology carefully? We're afraid of controversy. We don't want to find that we disagree too much with other people in our own congregation. So why on earth would we try to go out and seek out other people who are adherents to other faith traditions if we can't talk amongst ourselves in the family group? Well, that's just not good. What we've sometimes done instead in the last 50 years or so in Unitarian Universalism is we find a little subgroup. We find a little subgroup that totally adheres to our personal, often somewhat casually acquired beliefs, and we become part of a pagan cups group or a Christian UU Christian fellowship group or a little Buddhist Sangha group or the congregations of UU mystics, and we get on newsletter lists, and we go to General Assembly and go to workshops and find like-minded people, and the rest of the time we just keep our mouths shut. So what that means is we are not learning from other people about their religious journeys, and we're not sharing ours with them. And we're also becoming, if we adhere primarily to the subgroup that we choose, we are not keeping ourselves open in general to learning from the great richness available to us in the world. Now, Mississippi is granted not a hotbed of diversity and dialogue in world religions. I realize that the question here is, are you Baptist, Methodist, or Presbyterian, or possibly one of those strange Pentecostal people? And that's what I grew up with. And then because I had my wonderful cousins here who were the only Catholic family at that time in Nettleton, Mississippi, I was a little bit aware of more diversity, and I used to go to sometimes summer Bible school with Mike's sister Dottie in the summer. where I would hear the Catholics say things like, well, sister, are there any good Protestants? And I'd be like, well, shoot, what am I doing here? And among my friends at the Presbyterian Church, my cousins were considered incredibly exotic. You know, they were loved and popular, but exotic. And I didn't meet a Jewish person in the flesh until I moved to Pennsylvania when I was 12. But I always had an up on everybody because my father was a free thinker, loved controversy, and loved books. So in my possession from childhood, from the time I was about 11, I had a Time Life book on world religions. At which point I decided that Presbyterian churches were the most boring religious places in the country, and I was going to do better. I didn't know quite what, but as a very young child, I said, okay. And I flirted with Catholicism because I loved the ritual, and I kind of got a kick out of hearing Latin spoken, which I didn't understand a word of, and I, as a non-Catholic, was a bit disconcerted when they dropped the Catholic Mass, actually, in Latin. Then in high school, I found all these Jewish friends, and in college, I also went to a heavily Jewish university, and I decided, well, I'm going to convert to Judaism because they had even better stuff and even more fun traditions, to my opinion. So then as I got older, I just kept on learning. So today I want to share with you a few, not so much my personal full theology, but a few snippets of things that I have learned and utilized and been enriched by from other traditions, which is why I think even if you decide to pursue one particular faith path within our Unitarian Universalist communities, you do yourselves no favor if you follow this sort of don't ask, don't tell approach. And if the only question you ever get or the only answer you ever make is sort of what's your path, and you say, I'm a pagan, and stop there, bad girl, bad boy. Oh, I'm a UU Christian. Well, shame on you. Learn something else. To me, the world religions are a smorgasbord of sight, sound, taste, and smell similar to going to a great banquet with all sorts of rich and aromatic food spread out before you. While it is wrong to just take a little bit of a snippet of a tradition and think you know something about it, that's got its own pitfalls, to me it's equally wrong and dangerous to know nothing. So I'm going to take you on a little personal journey through sort of my drawing from the world's traditions. So as I said, I grew up as a Presbyterian and found that not to my liking at all. The hymns were, many of them were kind of dirges. Sometimes our hymns can sound a bit that way too, if not properly sung. Communion was a pitiful affair. How many of you were raised in one of those traditions where communion was little pieces of white bread and little tiny cups of grape juice? Oh my God, what a travesty. Anyway, so eventually I became an Episcopalian, which is closer to the Catholics, where we had an actual bottle, an actual, carafe of wine, and we had lovely chalices, and sometimes we actually broke actual bread. I didn't take to the fish food of the wafers, but I loved a good communion with wine and real bread. And I loved going up to the altar and receiving it. Okay, so actually you'll be surprised to know that in our Unitarian congregations in New England, many of which are closer to the Christian origins of our faith, there's still churches where you can go take communion. Not every week, but sometimes 4 times a year or so, and sometimes there's special services where smaller subgroups can go and arrange for taking a communion service. So I did get something out of my early training. So Christianity gave me that love of ritual when I discovered the Episcopal Church, but I didn't learn until much later how much of a mystical tradition there is in Christianity, much of which lies in the Catholic tradition, the Roman Catholic, and also in the Orthodox tradition. And they don't tell you much about that in Sunday school or Bible school because it's dangerous. What if you have an actual mystical experience of your very own? And then the teachers, the nuns or the priests, can't tell you what it was because you've had your own moment of epiphany, your own conviction. Well, all religions are a little skeptical about that. They want to tell you what it's supposed to feel like, what you're supposed to find. From the Jewish tradition, which I started exploring in high school and college, I was utterly fascinated by the celebration of the Sabbath. Having grown up where the Sunday simply meant church and then lunch and movies or something, depending on the level of piety you grew up with, the Jewish Sabbath, where you light a candle, you gather the family, you have special bread and a fancy meal on Friday night, and then in the Orthodox, or at least more conservative homes, you don't do much of anything for 24 hours, but perhaps read, meditate, talk together, and go to the synagogue. Well, I just thought that was wonderful. My God, a real day of rest, not a pretend day of rest. What a wonderful idea. And I still think everyone should embrace a Sabbath time to unhook from everything. Also from the Jewish tradition, I got the love of stories, because the Jews don't just have the Hebrew scriptures, they have the Midrash, which is stories about the stories, expanding on the stories, almost like fan fiction, if it were. They take a little passage, and rabbis over the years have written about that passage and come up with all sorts of different interpretations of it. So they have many books and many types of wisdom, and they have their own brand of mysticism and the Kabbalah. So that's Jewish and Christianity. Then I didn't get exposed to Islamic traditions until I was in college in D.C. One of my first little trips with friends of mine was down to the big mosque on Embassy Row in D.C., where we had, of course, to remove our shoes at the door and go in with our socks or our bare feet, and where women and men were not in the same space together. Now, I didn't take to that, but I have to say I found the Muslim call to prayers very compelling. And when I got older and read the Quran and read some more about Muhammad, there are plenty of things to not like about the faith, but there's a lot to recommend it. And one of the things that I'm most impressed with about Islam is they take charity very seriously. You know, and Jewish and Christian traditions, of course, we take up collections, and of course we talk about, you know, missional things. But in Islam, personal charity and community charity is taken much more seriously and is much more invested in, I think, than in most of the Jewish and Christian traditions. So very, very impressed with their extreme emphasis on taking care of those who need help. And also the frequency of prayers in Islam keeps spirituality uppermost in your mind. If you have to stop everything and take just a short few minutes to think about the bigger picture. The Eastern traditions, these three, of course, are what they call the Abrahamic religions. The Eastern religions are a whole different ballgame. But as you heard from my reading from Buddhism and Lao Tzu, many of the same lessons about love, compassion, living in the present and not worrying unduly about the future. From Buddhism, I learned to be validated in my understanding that life was often tragic and messy and sad, because his primary truth among the Four Noble Truths is that all of life is dukkha, or it's sort of doesn't translate exactly to suffering, but it means sort of inadequate. All of life is lacking in perfection, is how I like to think about it. And then he proceeds to expand on that, and then eventually to give us a really nice toolbox of ways to begin to grapple with that fact and to, in a sense, transcend it through the Eightfold Path that includes things like right contemplation, right relationship, and even, interestingly, right occupation. Buddhism is one of the only traditions that really tells us that what we do to earn our living can enhance or detract from our spiritual growth, which I think is something we all need to take seriously. From Taoism, which is kind of the religion that in some ways I resonate the most with from experience, we learn about the flow. We learn about the opposites, the famous yin-yang symbol, which actually came prior to the birth of traditional Taoism. It really is the original symbol in China that predated both Confucianism and Taoism. but it is about the idea that nothing is completely without its opposite. If you look at the yin-yang symbol, even within the black sphere, there's a little dot of white, and in this white sphere, there's a little dot of black, which gives us a visual representation of the insight that we are never all one thing. We are never completely masculine or completely feminine. We are never completely evil or completely good. We are all an interesting mixture. And their emphasis is on finding a balance between those tendencies, those extremes. The other learning from Taoism that has helped me a great deal in my life is a concept called Wu Wei, which some people have translated it sort of doing nothing, but it's a very unique way of doing nothing. It's kind of a creative, active, attentive way of not taking any premature action. And I found it to be a very helpful philosophy in my career, because often something would come up in any of the different jobs that I've had that seemed to require my immediate intervention. And often my immediate intervention only made things worse. So I developed what I call my management by going on vacation theory. I should have written a book about this. Basically, I decided if something got really bad at the office, I would just go away for a while and leave somebody else in charge. And so often when I came back, my assistant manager, assistant director had fixed it. And I'm like, oh, great, good work, good work. Keep up. And so I really found that leaving things alone, and I did the same thing in church work. There'd be some terrible argument at an annual meeting, and I'd think, I'm not going to say anything, because this may all blow over soon, and often it did. So those are some of the things I've gotten from Taoism that I have been very valuable. Confucianism has given me a strong sense of what he calls virtue, and he has a sense of joy. We think about Confucius primarily as a person who wanted to teach leaders and create leadership training in the sense that he did that, but Confucianism also has a very strong sense that balances very well against the Buddhist tendency to only see the suffering. It really focuses on the joy that one can find in life and small things. Now, those are some of the religions we hear the most about. Some of those have offshoots. Baha'i has grown out of Islam over in what is now Iran, coming from both Islamic understandings and some drawings from the ancient Zoroastrian religion. Sikhism is a sort of a combination of aspects of Hinduism, drawing in other things and with different teachers or gurus, and has a somewhat more progressive worldview. And one of the things that I have learned from Sikh friends is they have, again, like the Muslims do with a very high emphasis on charity, the Sikhs have a huge emphasis on sharing, especially of sharing food. And one of the hallmarks of their establishments is usually a big free meal called a langar that they have regularly, and anybody can come and eat with them and join with them without being in any way asked to become part of that faith community. Now, finally, and this has gotten, of course, huge in Unitarian Universalist circles, is something that falls loosely under tribal religions, pagan traditions, shamanic traditions, and from those diverse and certainly not any one thing kind of traditions that focus more on the natural world, on the earth, I have learned what is now one of the hallmarks of our Unitarian Universalist tradition, the interconnected web of all sentient beings, how we are all interconnected with the larger world. And if we could learn from this in a deep way, this would have a big impact on our ability to address our environmental issues, because that concept of Metaquiasan from the Native American culture, all my relations, we would get in a vivid way, understand how we are interconnected with everything that is. And also from the pagans, I have gathered a different way to sort of do councils and meetings, which is the sitting in a circle and sharing a talking stick so that everybody gets to speak and share their truth before anybody gets to speak again. Now, that's kind of my little quick survey trip. Now, I don't recommend that anybody take just a survey trip and stop. I suspect if you're along your way as you begin to learn a little bit about various traditions, something is going to speak to you deeply. For me, I still go back to especially the parables of Jesus from Christianity, which I think are open to endless discussion and interpretation and are much more deep and universal than we sometimes think. You can expound on the prodigal son and the Good Samaritan until the cows come home and never get to the bottom of perhaps their true teaching. There's a famous Presbyterian minister, Reverend Peter Gomes. He was an African-American gay man. He spoke with a British accent, although he'd never lived in Britain, which was interesting. But he was a famous preacher at the Memorial Church at Harvard. And I don't always remember things from sermons, even though I'm a professional and I should be much more attentive than I always am. But I will never forget a line that he said in a sermon where one of his texts was the prodigal son. He said, I've given at least 100 sermons on this. Sometimes I wish that boy had just never left home. Every time I think about that, it tickles me because it's true. That's one of the stories that will never leave us. You can interpret that story so many ways. You can identify with the different characters, as it were, in the story, the father, the son that stayed home, and of course the son that went away. You can imagine, is there an absent mother? What's the story on the mother there? Those kinds of stories are endless and universal, and there are stories similar to the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan, in many other religious traditions, and they're wisdom stories. So my charge to you today is start engaging, start reading, start thinking about the fact that you live in a world that is indeed a religious smorgasbord, and you're especially in these times of the highly charged nature and sometimes very negative nature of religious dialogue. As religious liberals, you owe it to yourself to know what you're talking about. So start talking, start reading, and start interacting, and stop staying in a little group of people that think just like you do. You'll find that you're richer for it, and you can never tell what's going to grip you. What's surprising is something that seems so alien can suddenly seem so meaningful when you read about it in greater depth.
Thanks for listening to the UUC of Tupelo's podcast. You can find us at uuctupeloms.org, on Facebook by searching for UUC Tupelo, or contact us by email at uuctupelocom@gmail.com. That's uuctupelocom@gmail.com. The UUC of Tupelo is a welcoming congregation who accept all people, regardless of creed, color, national origin, gender, or gender identity. We hope you have enjoyed this podcast, and as you head on your way, go in peace, believe in peace, create peace.